Welcome to the Storymakers Podcast, a place where curiosity and play meet to spark faith through the imagination. I'm your host, Mel, and I'll introduce you to new friends who will share hope for the kids and teens in your life, with a dose of encouragement for us grown-ups too. Let's get the party started. Hey, Storymakers! I'm so excited. Malik here on the podcast in Mockingbird World, Storymaker World, all the worlds. And we are here with Amy Mantravadi. I'm so excited to introduce to you a mother, a writer, a theologian. And Amy, welcome to the pod. Thank you for joining us. And we cannot wait to get into your story. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mel. I'm excited to talk to you again, having seen you in person recently. So this is great.
Amy and I met at a conference a couple years ago, and she was new on the scene in my mind because you had published a book at the time. Maybe that was like a couple years ago. Here we go. And it's called Broken Bonds. It was really exciting. And then I got to see you again and hear from you at the Mockingbird conference. So if you want to dig in more and learn about Amy, tune into that their podcasts out too on the Mockingbird pod, and you can hear from Amy there. But Amy, we want to hear about you. This is really exciting. I'm always excited to meet other writers and to meet people who are taking really high concepts, bringing them down to earth for the rest of us to digest and really get into it. So Amy, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, where are you? Where are you from? How did you get caught up in this gospel story?
Well, I am a writer living in Dayton, Ohio. I was actually raised in Michigan, but I'm pretty much a Midwesterner for most of my life, save for a little bit of time in college. And I came to writing novels when my previous career had basically, well, I won't say it crashed and burned. That would be the very negative way of putting it. The positive way would be to say that God closed one door and led me away from one thing into another thing. And my husband at the time when we married was still in the Air Force. So they moved us to Dayton, Ohio, where there's a large Air Force base. And my previous career was in international relations, which is like diplomacy between nations. And there's not a lot of that in Dayton, Ohio. So that forced me to undergo a career change. And the Lord, I guess, I would say now I can see that it was the Lord putting it in my heart. It didn't necessarily seem like that at the time. I just thought I'm at this point in my life where I don't really have anything else going on. If I'm ever going to make a try at writing a novel, I'll do it now. But I can see how through all this, the first 3 novels I wrote were set in medieval times about Empress Matilda of England. And I got to first have that experience of going back into history and taking a story of something that really happened and kind of trying to weave these themes through it. But at that point, I still had not fully come into my understanding I have now of what it means to be a novelist, or specifically a Christian novelist. I was just sort of learning how to write long fiction. I had written lots of things in my college career, but I'd never written a novel before. So that was sort of God just teaching me how the basics of how to write a novel. And during that time, God brought me into discovering the theology of the Reformation. And that experience was very important for me personally, which is something we can talk about. But also through that, I got the idea to write a couple of books that would help tell the story of the Reformation. And this helped me come to a new understanding of my calling as a novelist and a writer, which is to use stories to help communicate spiritual truths. And at the beginning of the first of my 2 novels about the Reformation, Broken Bonds, I say that this is actually a parable. And the parables Jesus told were stories that communicated some kind of spiritual truth that helped people to access things that, rather than, I like to say now, a lot of people would never buy a thick academic work about the Reformation and read it. but they maybe would read a story because you get to see how this is playing out in people's lives. And that makes it very practical and hopefully interesting. So that's kind of how I came to writing these novels. And I will say, just as a little aside, in reference to the recent Mockingbird conference, I bought 2 Storymaker books and gave them to my nieces. And I believe their exact words were, this is really cool. So, you know, you never know when you're giving a gift to 2 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
How they're who are kind of probably not very excited about anything at this point in their lives. But
yeah, they're like, why is my auntie giving me a digital cool.
And the biggest thing, I mean, this was truly a great act of self-sacrifice. I gave them the Holy Spirit plushie.
Oh my gosh.
Which, as you know, I fell in love with the minute I saw and
we'll send you a new one, Amy.
At the conference. And but you know, the Lord says it's better to give than receive. So I gave it up to them, and they thought that was pretty cool too. So, but I am missing it. So maybe there will be a second purchase.
I think you could get hooked up with the Holy Spirit. Yeah, well, you know, I love what you're doing, Amy. And we sort of felt the same kind of desire and urgency of like, we got caught up in the idea of like, being able to distinguish the law and the gospel, and like having a clear hermeneutic around like how to read the Bible, how to share the Bible with our kids, like how to find redemptive narratives. And Sally Lloyd-Jones was like is the godmother of being able to make the Bible so digestible for us. And so I think that what you're doing is certain people, what you realize, I think, in this process is like, oh, for some reason, God gave me eyes to see like how these things thread together. And I think that's a unique call. I was at a conference called Hope Words Writers Conference last year. And Hannah Anderson said, she's like, writing is holy work. And I think that's so true in so many ways, especially when you're illuminating and creating like these parables of bringing heavenly truth down to the rest of us who may not read a text, like a giant tome of like, what does the Reformation really mean? But story is like so baked into like how we navigate the world, how we figure out meaning, how we share truth with our kids and families. And so developing characters and getting into like, how did it all come for you, Amy? Like, was the process easier? Did these characters just like jump out for you as you were like developing these storylines?
Well, in learning about the Reformation, that was when I first came to hear that Martin Luther and Desiderius Erasmus, these 2 great scholars, had this debate with each other over the issue of whether human beings have free will. Specifically, not free will about what we're going to eat for breakfast, but can we choose to do good things? Can we choose to follow God on our own without any extra grace or extra help? Are we just that intelligent that we can make that decision?
Can we muster up our bootstraps, right? Yeah.
And at the time I was first learning about this was a question that had been on my mind for some time. And I was much more on Erasmus's side of things because I grew up in the United States of America, and I thought we're free individuals. That's what's really special about us. And that God it must be that we have free will, because otherwise we'd just be robots. And otherwise, how could you say that anybody had ever really done anything good? All these types of things are going through my mind. And, I've grown up watching Disney movies that, if you wish upon a star, you can make it happen. Anything you dream could come true. But the thing is, as I was becoming an adult, I was seeing that things don't always work out the way they do in Disney movies.
Totally.
And actually, going through some experiences like struggling with some depression, anxiety, the periods of that, I became quite aware that actually I didn't have any real ability to do a lot of these things. And then the other thing that helped change my mind was I spent 4 years. I said I was in international relations, and specifically I was working in the Middle East, and not located in the Middle East, but working at, understanding the conflicts of the Middle East. And I noticed how generation after generation of people had tried really hard to make peace deals and to make everybody get along. And it seems like it just doesn't work. And sure enough, right now, even as we speak, people are bombing each other and shooting at each other. And I said, wait a minute, are we not actually good? Are we like... Are we the baddies, actually? And along with all that, I had really struggled with not having much assurance of my salvation, because I at least had the impression, whether this is what people were trying to teach me or I just took away the wrong thing, that, it was about sort of working up faith in yourself, that faith was you making a rational decision. Mm-hmm. And although the church I had grown up in said that, we did have assurance of salvation, I didn't feel very assured, because I knew that I had doubts and I wasn't sure if my faith was strong enough. So anytime I would experience those doubts, I'm like, oh gosh, I am in trouble. So I decided, when I first heard about this debate they had gotten into, that I would try reading the 2 books, which was a bit of an undertaking. But it was very interesting, because at first when I read Erasmus's book, I'm like, oh yeah, he's making some good points. Then when I read Luther's book, which is much longer and very repetitive, it wasn't so much that any one point he made was so convincing on its own, but just being constantly beaten again and again and again with the same points. At the same time as I was having these experiences in my life, and just feeling, the older I got, that, gosh, I'm just such a sinner. There's like, I need 100% grace. I don't need just a little, I need all of it, And I came to see that actually it's not about realizing that we don't have free will, that actually we're, the way Luther would put it, we're turned in on ourselves.
Yeah, the nasal gazing.
Yeah, we're just not able to move out to other people in love on our own without grace. We're not able to grasp God. He has to reach down and grab us.
Yeah.
And realizing that actually was very freeing, because now I realize that even if I have a day where I'm feeling like my faith isn't as strong, that doesn't mean that I'm not really united to Christ, that I don't really have salvation. But actually, it's not so much about me holding on to God, it's that he's holding on to me.
Yeah.
And that was just a really important experience for me. And the thing about this law gospel distinction is that it can feel maybe very academic, sort of didactic. Hey, this is the kind of thing that if you're a theologian, you're worried about, but how does it affect me in my daily life? What I realized in looking at the stories of Luther, Erasmus, and also Luther's colleague, Philip Melanchthon, as I was beginning to get ready to write these books, I was studying their life histories a lot. And I was seeing these law gospel principles play out in their lives. And that's what made me realize I could kind of write law gospel novels. And what you see with Erasmus is, even though he believes that he has a much better opinion of human beings and their innate goodness, and he believes that we are free to choose to do good things, if you read his letters, he's always worried. He's constantly afraid about what's happening in the world. He's really confused. He's like, why aren't people behaving the way that they're supposed to behave? And you can tell that even himself, he doesn't seem like he feels he has any personal connection with God. And whereas when you read Luther's letters, you see that he's a very messed up human being. He's got lots of things wrong.
He's in touch
with this grace. He just keeps saying, he doesn't say, oh, I'm such a great person. He says, oh, I know that God's forgiving me in spite of the fact that I've got all these issues. And I found that very endearing, even though there are things that Luther wrote that I just shake my head and go, what were you thinking? What endear him to me is that he is very gospel focused. So I began to realize that even my daily life as a mother, as a wife, all the things I'm trying to do, even as a writer, I've had just recently, I've submitted articles to multiple organizations that have turned me down. Does that mean I'm a complete failure? Well, no, because actually that's not where my worth and my identity is coming from.
Yeah.
And
I think this is so important, especially for all of us grownups out there, because this, I think, vision and setting our gospel imagination on this idea of like God reaching down to us versus us reaching up to God. And like when you pointed out about Erasmus, like feeling so disappointed and frustrated with the people around him, that is so practical and true for parenting and with our own churches or ministries that we're in. If we really think that they've got control or they could make all the right choices, they just have to like get it together and do it, then that just is a recipe for resentment, disconnection, no place for grace, no place for I'm sorry. It's a lot of you begin to weave these relationships that are not totally honest and not totally connected to the source. And and so much of like when you think about Genesis 1-3, and we're thinking about Adam and Eve reaching up to be just like God, and not realizing that they've been given everything, that really sets everything in towards the wrong direction. And so I think that's what's so important about your book, Amy, and the writing that you're doing, because we need our minds reoriented over and over again. And that comes from all sorts of different directions and avenues. So Amy, in the process of like going through this book and writing, and you have a second book coming, what has sort of been transformative for you? Like what's been a reminder that's come to you again and again in the, maybe you feel more assured?
Well, as I started to write these books, my son was about 2 years old at the time. And we started to notice that there were some things about him that were a little bit different than other children. Other children were progressing in a lot of areas, and my son just seemed to be like stalling, like for whatever reason, it wasn't clicking. And coincidentally, at the same time in these novels, Philip Melanchthon, he and his wife have their second child. And the second child, we know from some historical details, the second child had a complicated birth. And there were a lot of concerns about that child's development. Now, that child did end up doing okay. Philip Melanchthon Jr. Ended up, having a productive adulthood. But when he was young, there were a lot of concerns about him. And I was writing about that at the same time as I was starting to have concerns about my own son. And it turns out our son is autistic, pretty significantly. So, in that he needs a more significant amount of support than some other people who have autism, and that he's very language delayed, and very delayed in social skills, other things of that nature, to the point that it's concern for his safety at times, to where we really feel like we don't know his thoughts and feelings as much as we wish. And parenting a child with some, I guess you could say, unique needs. I don't know how you want to put it, but it has made me realize my own inabilities as a mother, because I can do more and try harder, but I can't. There's no amount of therapies. There's no amount of anything that's just going to make this go poof and go away. In fact, I really liked in the most recent Mockingbird issue of the magazine, Stephanie Phillips, I believe it is, who is the parent of an autistic child as well, has written about the fact that for years and years, the way autism was treated was, we need to change your behavior to make it like normal people's behavior. Now, there are some behavioral things with my son that we do want to change. For example, sometimes he does things that hurt us, not seriously, not to injure us, but there are some things he does that could hurt himself or us. But there are other things that they're just different. And when we get this focus of, well, this is a behavior problem and we just need to change the behavior, instead of looking at my concern is who my son is as a person, wanting him to be able to express that, wanting him to be able to have support as he gets older. That is much more of a grace-based gospel focus, to realize that when my son is quote unquote misbehaving, it's not necessarily that he's just a stinker. He actually might not understand what I'm trying to tell him to do. And having that experience while I'm writing these books about how actually we're also dependent on grace and it's not about our performance, it all just kind of came together. And to realize that even though I'm not, on the spectrum, there are other ways that I also have inabilities. There are ways my husband has inabilities, and all of us have them. And how even something like parenting becomes so different when you get that, when instead of being a completely law-based parent, you become a gospel-based parent, because it's not just my son who needs the gospel from me. I need the gospel as a parent, because otherwise I'll be at the end of the day thinking, well, it's been a couple years in speech therapy and he's still not able to answer most basic questions. I guess I'm a failure as a mother. Well, no, because we understand that actually we have inabilities, and that's okay, because ultimately we are righteous in Christ. We're forgiven in Christ. We are treasured and valued and loved beyond what we could possibly understand. Having that confidence is what allows me every day to go through this journey of motherhood. And I think everybody, whether you're a young person or a very old person, you have things like that in your life that seem tragic in one way, but actually God is using those to show you how dependent you are on grace. And, I accept it as a gift for that reason. It's a very strange kind of gift. But I don't know that I ever would have realized my dependence on grace and been as able to show grace to others if I hadn't gone through this experience. And so that also helped me to understand one of the characters a little better as I was writing him in the book. So it all kind of came together like that.
That's amazing. Well, one thing, I don't know if you know this about me, Amy, but I worked in behavioral health for like a decade. And
you had mentioned that. Yeah.
In that period of time, my husband and I were in seminary, and we were learning about like the law and the gospel from Paul Zoll, and you're learning about like, do we have free will or don't we have free will, and how can we be compassionate with one another? And I realized too in my work, when you would go into spaces or into families or into church or school context, oftentimes the call to action was really like, can you make this person better, right? Reform them, just as like Stephanie was describing. That was like the goal and the approach. And what I realized in context of like this new theological framework, it's like, well, actually, like if everyone around in the environment shifts towards a grace forward approach, then right, you're discovering a curiosity, you're learning who they are. It's not about sort of these like check marks of, I hope, this is who they need to be or what they're going to be like. But really like getting curious and like, who is this person? And can I have a relationship with this person? And that's much more meaningful than a checklist. And I think the same is true for our kids. And right, children really form us. It's not just like these, I don't know, they're not these people that have just been given to us that we get to shape, but they also shape us too, because we're in a family and families shape you, whether you like it or not. So it's like part of the whole process. And I think also this perspective, Amy, that you're sharing is so important, because we need to have an imagination that God is moving towards our kids over and over again, especially as they're moving through adolescence or young adulthood, and people feel really challenged by their young adults in their families, and they're not maybe looking or behaving in the way or have the life that your parents had imagined for them. And and there's grace for that too. So I think that's really important, not just for us to like get it correct, but for us to be able to live and thrive in relationship with one another. So that's really amazing. And I think telling it in stories is super helpful. Amy, has there been a story for you in your own life that's kind of shaped you, or like sort of opened your eyes to see like, oh, God is moving towards me?
Well, I'm sure there have been so many over the years, but one of the authors who has influenced me the most is J.R.R. Tolkien, which, I know that's not a very original answer, but he's maybe influenced me in a way that is a little less typical, which is that I really love some of his, not just his most famous works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, going back into a lot of his other writings, which tell like the earlier history of that same world. So the Silmarillion is the main one here. And if you go back in there, he tells all about this creation narrative, which I think it's sort of a thinly veiled allegory to how our own world was created, that actually I feel helps me to understand the theology of creation. But then you see that this world is created, and then there's this big bad villain named Morgoth who's always trying to mess everything up. And you, at various times, the forces of good will defeat him and he'll be driven back, but then he'll, come back in some other form. And actually even Morgoth at one point is finally defeated, but then Sauron, the villain in The Lord of the Rings, comes along. And the principle that Tolkien has here is he calls it the long defeat, which is that always evil is just sort of baked into the world. And we understand that as the sinful nature, the curse of sin on the world. Because of that, the things we do will always ultimately break down. Our abilities will always ultimately break down. And the principle that you find a little bit in Lord of the Rings, you see hints of it, but you really get in the Silmarillion, is that eventually God himself is going to have to step in to this situation to fix it. Because otherwise he's going to have to recreate this world, because otherwise the evil's just going to still be there. You see that a little bit in Lord of the Rings, and there are hints that Frodo getting the ring and destroying it, that there was some other will at work that allowed that to happen. But this has been really helpful for me as I think about politics and about history, but also about my own life, because this is an idea that's very central, for instance, to Martin Luther's theology about salvation having to come from the outside. God has to become incarnate in the world through Jesus Christ in order to save us. And now in our individual lives, we need God to come in and save us, because otherwise, we might get a little better for a while, but we're ultimately going to be back in that same bad place. We're never going to have ultimate victory until God comes in and just makes a new creation in us. So that is something that, his fiction always really captured my mind. I'm not going to put my fiction up there on the same level as his. It's actually a very different kind of fiction. But in so many ways, he's just really influenced me. And I now see that a lot of Tolkien's ideas are coming from, for instance, St. Augustine, who lived 1,500 years ago. And there are even echoes with some of the Protestant reformers. There are echoes with all kinds of theologians. So, but I do appreciate that even in this grand myth that he's creating, you see that gospel principle kind of embedded quietly, because, of course, these books are not officially Christian books. But it's there if you know where to look for it.
Yeah, I think to have lenses to see like the play of allegory and metaphor, and this image-bearing nature that we have. So in all that we do, we are bearing, like, there is glory to God in some ways, and he's seen in some places, especially in story. And I was going to ask you, Amy, about like metaphor and allegory and like building your worlds. When you're in the process of like thinking about these worlds, like, are you like layering them? Do you know where they're going to land? Or is it just brick by brick by brick?
because of the specific type of historical fiction I'm writing, I don't have to worry about that quite as much, because what I have to do is research and find out what the world was like, and then I can just convey that. Now, there is obviously some that has to come completely out of my imagination, but not as much. If the Lord does allow me to write another novel beyond this, it will be a more original story. So I will have to do more world building kind of stuff. And maybe I will have more to report to you then. But I think that it's very helpful as you're doing these things to always think about what is serving the main purpose of the story. Even with the type of fiction I do, you have to think about this, because I do lots of research about all kinds of buildings and towns and people and what were they eating and what were they reading. And the temptation is to want to include all of that for the reader. But the important thing actually is, if I'm writing a parable, then what serves the parable? Yeah. And I kind of did put this in my disclaimer at the beginning of my first Broken Bonds, the first of my 2 Reformation novels. You're not going to see everything that Luther, Erasmus, and Melanchthon did in the years 15, 24, and 25. There's some stuff I completely left out. I'm not going to tell you too much about the type of shoes they wore, because that's just not important. I'm not going to talk about all the work that Luther did putting together the first German language hymnal, because, Protestant hymnal, because it just doesn't apply to the story. So I think there actually is a need, as much as building a world, to keep it contained, because, and this is actually a complaint some people have had about Tolkien, that he feels a need to describe every blade of grass, as people usually say. I think, if you read the Silmarillion, that definitely isn't the case, but I think people are thinking about the first part of the Lord of the Rings there. And, modern audiences don't like that as much. So everything you're doing, it is kind of a balancing act. It has to serve the theological, spiritual purposes. It has to serve, the purposes of just entertainment, because if it's not entertaining, no one's going to want to read it. Then it is just an academic book, and we might as well buy an academic book. So, I think that is really challenging. But, as I'm going along, getting ready to write a book, if I'll be thinking through things, and if something comes to my mind, even something I encounter in my life, I'm like, oh, that's really cool. How could I somehow work that in? Yeah. And I'll sort of have a document where I'm keeping track of that kind of thing. And then I'll see where I can insert it in the story.
Well, I think that's such great advice. I mean, not just as a writer and creator, but also just in parenting, or even engaging with our friends about information or a story, because oftentimes we don't edit ourselves and we just want to fully unload, or even when we're interfacing with kids or our nieces and nephews, and just like, I want to tell you all of the things. So it's like, well, I got to think about how I want to tell you that, because, right, you want them to walk away with the summary or the parable or like the important piece of it. And so I think that's great, just in general advice for all of us to be thinking about, like, what is the point? What am I trying to say? Like, is this digestible for the person that's right in front of me? That's so amazing. Well, Amy, I'm so excited for our listeners to know about Broken Bonds. There's a second one coming out. Do you have a Substack? Is there other places where people should go and find you?
Oh, yes. I'm very much on Substack, amymantravadi.substack.com. And the second of my 2 Reformation novels, which is a direct sequel to the first one, it's called Face to Face, and you can pre-order it now on Amazon, coming out November 11th.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I write for 1517, and I also write sometimes for Mockingbird and other organizations. So, you'll see me around. But if you do subscribe to my Substack, I link to all articles published at other places. each week in my posts there. So you'll get everything if you.
That's amazing. Well, I think especially for all of us who love story, who are always seeking to reorient our imaginations and to get a reframe on like how God is moving towards us. I would say check out Amy's writing, subscribe and log in. And Storymakers, you got to hear from Amy here and we're so excited. So follow her along. Lots of love. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Storymakers podcast was made possible by the Storymakers team and our generous community of donors. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review the Storymakers podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Share the show with a friend or two and use the code SMPodcast10 for 10% off your next adventure. Remember, be free and have fun.